It's no fault of Elvis. He loved the song.
She is the woman who turned heartbreak into gold records, poverty into philanthropy, and a one-room mountain cabin into a worldwide empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Dolly Parton is, without question, one of the most beloved human beings to ever grace the stages of Nashville or Hollywood. She smiles at everyone, praises everyone publicly, and has built an entire career on warmth, generosity, and Southern charm. But here's a truth that most people have never been told. That smile has limits. That grace has a breaking point. And behind those rhinestone curtains, there are names that make Dolly Parton's jaw tighten and her eyes go cold. We are not talking about small disagreements or minor misunderstandings. We are talking about years of tension, courtroom battles, public humiliations, stolen royalties, and professional betrayals that shook Dolly to her very core. These are the people who underestimated her, tried to control her, mocked her publicly, dismissed her genius, and in some cases, attempted to profit off the sweat of her creative soul. Some of them smiled at her in public, while plotting against her in private. Some of them praised her music, while quietly working to own it. And one of them, one of the most famous human beings who ever lived, never forgave her for saying no. Today, we are pulling back the velvet curtain on Dolly Parton's most explosive, most painful, and most surprising personal conflicts. These are the 5 singers and personalities that Dolly Parton genuinely could not stand. Stay with us, because by the time we reach the end of this list, your entire understanding of America's sweetheart is going to shift forever. To understand Dolly Parton's first and perhaps most emotionally devastating feud, you have to understand what it feels like to owe someone your career while simultaneously being suffocated by them. Porter Wagoner was already a towering figure in country music when Dolly was still finding her footing in Nashville. His syndicated television program reached millions of American homes every week, and his instinct for talent was sharp and legendary. When he invited Dolly to join his show in the late 1960s, replacing his beloved previous vocalist Norma Jean, he was doing her what appeared to be an enormous favor. Audiences booed Dolly at first. They wrote her angry letters. They did not want Norma Jean replaced. But Porter held firm, and Dolly stayed gracious, and together they built something genuinely magical. Their harmonies were electric. Their chemistry was undeniable. They scored hit after hit and became one of the most celebrated duos in the history of country music. But here is what the cameras never showed you. Behind every decision, behind every booking, behind every song selection, Porter Wagoner had his hand firmly on the controls. He managed her appearances. He decided what they would record. He determined who she could speak to and what professional moves she could make. For a woman of Dolly Parton's extraordinary intellectual and creative ability, this was not a partnership. It was a gilded cage. As the years passed and Dolly's individual star began to outgrow the framework of their professional relationship, she started dreaming bigger. She had ambitions that stretched far beyond television duets and shared billing. She was a songwriter of rare gifts, and she knew it. She wanted to make albums that reflected her own vision, tour on her own terms, and build something that belonged entirely to herself. But Porter could not accept that evolution. He had built her up, in his mind, and he was not ready to let her walk away. When she finally left the show in 1974, the break appeared civil on the surface. But 5 years later, in 1979, Porter Wagoner sued Dolly Parton for $3 million, claiming she had violated their contract and owed him a percentage of everything she had earned since departing. To Dolly, this was not a legal dispute. It was a personal knife in the back from someone she had genuinely cared for, respected, and in many ways loved like family. She settled the case quietly, because that is what Dolly does. She does not go to war in public, but the emotional damage ran deep, and she never forgot that the man who gave her a platform eventually tried to use that same platform as a leash. There are very few names in the history of recorded music that carry the kind of weight that Elvis Presley's does. He was the king. He was a force of nature, a cultural earthquake, and a human being whose talent genuinely defied easy description. And in the mid-1970s, the king of rock and roll wanted to cover Dolly Parton's song, I Will Always Love You. For most songwriters at that stage of their career, that phone call would have represented the greatest moment of their professional lives. But for Dolly, It became one of the most painful experiences she had ever endured. The song was not just a song to Dolly. She had written it as a farewell to Porter Wagoner, a deeply personal expression of love, gratitude, and the kind of bittersweet departure that only someone who truly cares about someone can write. It had already become a #1 country hit, and it was the crown jewel of her publishing catalog. So when Elvis's team came calling, Dolly was flattered. But then came the terms. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's notoriously ruthless and demanding manager, informed Dolly that before Elvis would record any song, the songwriter was required to hand over at least 50% of the publishing rights. He presented this not as a negotiation, but as a standard arrangement, as though Dolly should consider herself lucky to be asked. Dolly Parton, who had fought her entire life for creative ownership and professional respect, looked at that demand and said no. She told Colonel Parker directly that this song was the most important copyright in her entire publishing company, and that she simply could not agree to those terms. Elvis was reportedly furious. Dolly later recalled that he had genuinely loved the song, that he was not simply pursuing it for commercial reasons, but had felt a real emotional connection to it, and that made the rejection sting even more on his side. According to Dolly, there was a noticeable coldness between them afterward that never fully thawed. She later admitted in interviews that she did not believe Elvis ever entirely forgave her, and that knowledge genuinely broke her heart because she admired him enormously as an artist. But she held her ground, and 17 years later, Whitney Houston recorded that same song and turned it into the most commercially successful love ballad of the entire 20th century, earning Dolly millions upon millions in royalties. That decision to say no to Elvis is now considered one of the most brilliant and courageous moments in music business history. On paper, the collaboration between Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris should have been the most harmonious creative partnership in the history of country music. 3 extraordinary voices, 3 distinct but complementary artistic personalities, and a shared vision for an album that honored the deepest roots of American music. Their 1987 release, Trio, was a genuine masterpiece, going platinum and winning a Grammy, and earning the kind of critical and commercial praise that most artists spend entire careers chasing. But the road to that album was paved with genuine tension, and the relationship between Dolly and Linda, in particular, was fraught with friction from nearly the very beginning of their work together. Dolly Parton operates with extraordinary efficiency in the studio. She is the kind of artist who trusts her instincts, delivers powerful vocal performances quickly, and believes that the spontaneous emotional truth of a first or second take is often irreplaceable. Linda Ronstadt's approach was fundamentally different. She was a perfectionist in the most demanding sense of the word, capable of spending hours refining a single vocal passage until every nuance matched her precise internal vision. These two philosophies, both entirely valid in their own right, created a grinding friction that reportedly tested everyone's patience in the room. Dolly later revealed that working alongside Linda during those sessions pushed her to the absolute edge of her considerable reserves of Southern grace. She made no secret of the fact that she had wanted to explode on more than one occasion, and the frustrations were not entirely one-directional. Linda Ronstadt, for her part, was vocal in interviews about her belief that Dolly was unreliable during the recording process, that she would cancel sessions without sufficient notice, and that her commitment to the collaborative project sometimes seemed secondary to the demands of her solo career. Linda reportedly stated plainly that she had no desire to work with Dolly in that capacity again, and that the lack of professional consistency had damaged what should have been a purely joyful creative experience. The wounds between these two women were never entirely healed, and while the music they made together remains celebrated to this day, the friendship behind it never recovered its original warmth. Of all the conflicts on this list, the one that produced the most visceral and unguarded public response from Dolly Parton involved a man who was not a singer at all, but whose platform made him one of the most dangerous voices in American entertainment. In 2008, Howard Stern, the self-proclaimed king of all media and one of radio's most deliberately provocative personalities, authorized a segment on his program in which his production team took recordings of Dolly's voice from her published audiobook and edited them together to manufacture a fake interview. The resulting audio made Dolly sound as though she was saying extraordinarily vulgar, racist, and deeply offensive things about fellow artists and about her own life and body. Dolly Parton, who had spent decades carefully and genuinely cultivating a reputation for kindness, decency, and grace, was devastated in a way that very few events in her long career had ever managed to achieve. She issued a public statement that was remarkable precisely because it abandoned her usual diplomatic restraint entirely. She said she had never been so shocked, hurt, and humiliated in her entire life. She described what Stern had done as vile, and she made the extraordinary and extremely rare step of directly threatening legal action, saying that if there was ever going to be a lawsuit, this would be the moment that justified it. Stern shrugged. He called it satire. He dismissed the outrage as oversensitivity. He did not apologize, did not express genuine regret, and moved on to the next segment as though nothing of consequence had occurred. The contrast between his indifference and Dolly's very real pain was striking and widely noted. It was not until 2023, 15 full years later, that Dolly agreed to appear on Stern's program to promote her rock album Rockstar. She was gracious. She was professional. But people who watched that interview closely could feel the restraint underneath the politeness, the careful distance of a woman who had not forgotten what had been done to her. The final name on this list is perhaps the most unexpected, because this conflict was not born from a lawsuit or a fabricated audio clip or a stolen royalty. It was born from something that, for a woman as deeply invested in her creative identity as Dolly Parton, may have been even more wounding. Jeff Tweedy, the frontman and creative engine behind the critically revered alternative country band Wilco, gave an interview in which he openly and dismissively criticized Dolly Parton's songwriting, suggesting that her lyrics were superficial, that her appeal was rooted in persona rather than genuine artistic depth, and that her catalog, while commercially successful, lacked a complexity that truly distinguished great songwriting from merely popular songwriting. He even made the specific and widely quoted remark that Dolly wrote both Jolene and I Will Always Love You on the same day, and that in his view, she should have simply stopped writing after Jolene. It was presented as a backhanded compliment, but it landed as a dismissal of an entire life's work. Dolly Parton has written over 3,000 songs. She has channeled her poverty, her heartbreak, her faith, her ambitions, and her most private emotional experiences into lyrics that have comforted, inspired, and moved hundreds of millions of people across generations and continents. To have a fellow musician, someone who understands from the inside how much of yourself goes into the creative process, reduce all of that to a punchline was not something Dolly found easy to overlook. Reports confirmed that she was aware of the comments and deeply unhappy about them. What makes Dolly Parton's story genuinely extraordinary is not just the talent, not just the business acumen, not just the philanthropy or the longevity or the remarkable resilience. It is the fact that through every single one of these conflicts, through lawsuits and humiliations and dismissals and betrayals, she kept choosing grace over revenge. She kept showing up, kept creating, kept giving. And every single person on this list, in their own way, ultimately had to reckon with the fact that they had underestimated her. The girl from the one-room cabin in the Smoky Mountains did not just survive these feuds. She outlasted every single one of them, and she did it without ever losing herself in the process. That is the real story of Dolly Parton, and now you know it.